Well, welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay, joined by Eric Stearns, and today we're digging into my message from Sunday, which was about just a little bit more of our United Methodist identity, where the rubber meets the road, and how our love of God is meant to go somewhere, and just talking a little bit more about our history and the way that John Wesley lived out his faith. We're going to also dig into our next sermon series as well. So let's get into it.
Sounds good. Can you start with where or why did the United Brethren and the Methodist Church merge?
Yeah, so that is a lot of to do with finances. The EUB was smaller than the Methodist Church, and there were just kind of a lot of financial realities of existing that it made sense for us to combine forces. There are people on the Methodist side of things that came from the Methodist background that said that it was not so much of a mutual merger as it was the Methodist Church bailing out the Evangelical United Brethren.
Interesting.
I don't know. I mean, take it with a salt lick, because there are other, there are still, that was only in 68. So there are still pastors serving in our conference that were EUB, like they were raised EUB. And then they became Methodists. I was talking to a parishioner here on Sunday that was raised EUB. And then when they moved to Canton, they couldn't find an Evangelical United Brethren church. So they called their old pastor and said, "What do? We don't have an EUB church here." And the pastor had to say, "Well, because we merged with the United Methodist Church, so you find yourself a United Methodist Church, and that's where you should go to church." And so that's why they're a part of our congregation. They're from that old EUB heritage. That's kind of the behind the scenes of why that happened. And then so it had to be ratified first by us, and then by the EUB, and then they had a uniting conference in Dallas in the 60s. So in the back of our hymnal, we have a confession of faith from the United Church in Canada, and that's always struck me kind of weird as to why that was, because it's not a part of the globally United Methodist body or the Methodist bodies of that we recognize, and it's because the EUB, if they did not want to join the United Methodist Church, a lot of them joined the United Church in Canada. So as a way of acknowledging our heritage, they left that confession of faith in our hymnal.
Beliefs wise, how close are were the two denominations at the time?
Very. They were really very close. The reason, so the biggest the biggest theological tentpole that kind of separated us was around evangelism and a heritage of sharing our faith story. So Legacy in Bismarck was first EUB, before it was first United Methodist Church in Bismarck, before it turned into Legacy. And they were served in two different terms by Pastor Kermit Culver. And Kermit Culver is an old EUB, was raised EUB. And so wanted that faith sharing heritage to be a really, really big part of Legacy's identity. And so like when a couple of years ago, the book by Bishop Schnase, The Five Practices of Fruitful Congregations was really popular. When Legacy talked about that, they always added things from their EUB heritage. And the biggest one was around faith sharing and evangelism. So yeah, let's see.
So were they a Wesley following denomination or no?
Yes. So the EUB, that part of John Wesley's story was hanging out with the German Moravians on the ship back from Georgia to Britain. They were in this windstorm and the ship almost sank, and the Moravians were like hanging out, praising God, singing hymns, reciting scripture, John Wesley was freaking out because he's like, I don't want to die. And so he was having this crisis of faith while he was watching these people, these German Moravians, and so he kind of attached himself to them. And so and like Moravians still exist. There are still Moravian churches around, but the EUB kind of came from that group of Christians. So Otterbein, Bohm, and a couple other theologians that would have been important to John Wesley, were a part of forming the predecessor denominations that led to the EUB.
Got it.
Yep.
So in the history of the church,
Hmm.
we always talk about churches breaking off, but this one was two denominations coming together.
Right.
Is that normal?
Not really, no. It's usually more of the breaking off that happens.
Mhm.
Like you are married to someone that went to Mo Parish, and that is a part of the LCMC, but they used to be a part of a different Lutheran flavor. That's more the norm. And like that's what we've just been through with the break off of the GMC and the founding of an entirely new expression of Wesley, of Wesleyan theology. That's more typical than denominations coming together. What you will find, though, is that there are certain denominations entering into full communion relationships with one another. Basically, what a full communion membership looks like, or a full communion partnership, means that each denomination embraces the other as a part of one church. We recognize one another's sacraments and ministerial orders. And so, like, if push were to come to shove, that an ELCA church was like, we really don't know what we're going to do for a pastor. They could call my bishop and say, hey, Clay, that'd be cool. Will you let him go? So like we currently have pastors serving across denominational lines, like that within those churches that we do have full communion relationships with. So the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and we just at our last general conference in 2024, which is the global body that legislates the life of the United Methodist Church, we ratified our half of a full communion relationship with the Episcopal Church. They are meeting in 2027 to ratify their part, but they've been at the table this entire time. We've been waiting until we deal with kind of our stuff before we entered into that partnership with them. So, yep. So if push came to shove, I could then serve as the Episcopal priest and vice versa, and that would be another working relationship that we do have. So,
Okay, we're going to go back one more then. So Wesley, our friend, um, he broke from the Church of England,
mhm.
but so I'm listening to the History of Methodism podcast right now.
Nice.
Um, he talked about Wesley's dad, right?
Mhm.
Was a priest in the Church of England.
Correct.
Can you can you break that down a little bit? Was that a Catholic church or what was that church?
No. So Henry VIII, the King of England, wanted a divorce from his wife because she was not providing him with a male heir to the throne. And this is when Great Britain was Catholic. There was no church other than the Catholic Church. And because of what the Catholic Church still believes about marriage, the divorce was never granted. And so King Henry said, well, fine then, bite me. I'm going to start my own denomination. And so he pulled together some theologians and said, okay, we're doing this, fix it. Create this thing called the Church of England, which is the state church of the country of Great Britain. And so that's where the Church of England comes from. It comes all the way back from when Henry VIII wanted a divorce and couldn't get one, so he started his own church to make that happen because that had to happen through the church in that day and at that time. Um, So that's how the Church of England started. It has a very auspicious beginning, but then it did find its footing theologically through Thomas Cranmer and other theologians as well. And then, so fast forward sometime into history, Samuel Wesley becomes a priest in the Church of England. So it would be like the Anglican Church, or the American equivalent is the Episcopal Church, which is why that full communion partnership with the Episcopal Church is so interesting for us, because it's us and our mother denomination coming back to the table with one another in a way that hasn't happened in 200 years.
Hmm.
So Samuel, I mean, for his entire life, and even John Wesley too, he was never excommunicated from the Church of England. He lived and died as an Anglican priest, as a Church of England priest. So Samuel served a couple of different places. Most notably in at Epworth was his favorite place. Um, and then served for a while with John Wesley as his basically his associate pastor. In that time between when John Wesley was finished at Oxford, and then between when he was done at Oxford and then becoming a professor at Oxford. Um, so he was a parish priest for a while, before then going back to be a professor and starting the Holy Club, and then kind of getting the ball rolling. So yeah, his dad was a priest.
It's just very interesting.
Hmm. Yep. Has the podcast gotten into the death of Samuel Wesley and him being buried at Epworth? And then John Wesley wanting to go and preach there and being refused?
So actually, so at first, so the very first episode, it talked about Henry VIII wanting a divorce. Roman Catholic Church wouldn't let him do it, so then he,
Hmm.
starts his own. But then it actually goes back to, okay, who's Martin Luther? What's the Reformation? And so
Mm.
right now we're talking Reformation.
Samuel Wesley not started, but served as the priest at a church called Epworth for a very, very long time, Epworth, England. And St. Andrew's Church. So he eventually died. And was buried outside of the church, in the cemetery outside of the church. John Wesley, when he was doing a lot of his more radical, calling people to holiness, get the ball rolling preaching, wanted to go back and preach at Epworth. And the priest there said no, that John Wesley was not allowed to preach there. And so, because how cemeteries work is that the family owns that plot of land, John Wesley had no other choice but to stand on his father's grave and preach a sermon.
Hmm.
So he wasn't allowed to preach inside the church. He'd been dabbling his toe in this out of doors preaching, which he considered to be vile, and then found himself outside the church that his dad had served, his favorite place, because that's where they had the fire in the rectory, and so yeah, he preached from his dad's grave.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's
It would be
fascinating.
quite the sight. I don't know.
Mhm.
We do Tales from the Grave as a part of the Canton Historical Society. That would be an interesting take on that, I guess. But
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
yep.
Yeah, it's just the history part of all of this is so fascinating.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
think it's just fun to understand where we came from,
it
and it's
is.
good for us to understand where we came from.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, I think I mean, obviously I'm the one that preached the sermon series, so yes, I agree with you. I think it is really important for us to know who we are, or who we have been, and as a way of helping us to find, and define who we are going forward.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, this sermon, I think, um, when people ask why I'm a Methodist, this is the loving outside of our walls is always my reasoning. But we're
Hmm.
always the ones to reach out and support and do all of the things outside of our church. And so, yeah, we've talked about this topic countless times on this
Hmm.
podcast.
Yep.
Um, but it was kind of interesting to hear the historical context of teaching kids how to read,
Yeah.
or the Sunday school angle of it. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, because we were just talking about the way that the government ran, and it being very, very different. We as Americans, we have a school system. We have taxes that go right to support, a public school system, and that did not exist, in that day and age. So what Wesley saw was rich people, and he benefited from this directly. He was educated, so he benefited from it directly of being able to go and attend a school. And then also then for Wesley and his friends to then go and attend Oxford, which, still has the gravitas that it does, then as now. That
Hmm.
was a big deal. And so all he saw was impoverished youth not being afforded those same, literally afforded those same opportunities, and just the injustice of that, of why does little Jimmy that can't afford school so much, or why is little Jimmy that can afford school so much better than little Jane that can't? And so, who do we really need to be helping? How do we raise people up? And the biggest way that they can is through education. And so, because they believe that was really important, they educated, they taught, they went and hung out in orphanages. They found ways to use scripture to teach people how to read. So not only were you introducing them to the life-saving love of Jesus Christ, you were also giving them the literal skills to, because by this time the Gutenberg Bible had been there a long time. They had access to scripture in their native language of English, and so they they taught. They taught them how to read. They taught them how to function. They taught them how to thrive as a way of helping them raise up that next that social step of being more educated than those that could be around them. But yeah, just and to provide it in a way that was either free or cost effective.
Hmm. Yeah, it really is interesting because I mean, what that indicates is at that time, religion, school, everything was really just for the rich,
Yes,
and it was,
definitely.
yeah, you couldn't get there. There's no way to get there.
hmm Yeah.
Hmm. No wonder the United States did, no wonder the revolution was a thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are things that are directly correlated of this is what we had to deal with in Britain and this is what we don't want to deal with anymore, and so let's start our own country.
Hmm. We could talk about how we show love to other people, but I feel like we've talked about it so much that
Yeah. Yep.
that's why I thought we could take this down to historical pathway. I thought it was kind of fun.
Definitely.
Um, is there anything else that you cut?
No, I kind of decided to go for it on Sunday. We had new members and we had communion, and I think we ran over by like 7 minutes, but
I'm sure
it,
you were reminded of that.
I really wasn't this time around. So
That's good.
yeah, well, and mainly because we did a children's sermon too, so I kept,
Hmm.
all of the Stearns and cousins happy. So
Hmm.
I didn't hear it
Exactly.
from Everett and Oliver. So
That's right.
even though they weren't there, I know they were still watching church online. So
They were sitting in front of the TV and then they
yes,
ran up to the pantry to get a piece of candy. Don't worry.
that's what Jenna told me too. That's awesome.
Hmm.
Yeah. So no, I really didn't cut much. I mean, and because I knew what Sunday looked like, I knew that I had to, kind of had to keep it brief, and also because talking about loving others is one of my favorite things to talk about. I also have to like temper it a little bit because we have talked about it quite a bit.
Hmm.
I mean, and it is central to who we are as United Methodists. Like an earlier draft of this sermon did include my story with Dr. Thompson in seminary, asking why I am, or why a certain person would be a part of a denomination. And one of the things that I mentioned was UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief. The fact that we are a Christian denomination with a relief agency, that is very responsive. And Dr. Thompson said, "Ugh, Clay, no one's a Methodist because of UMCOR." And I said, hi, play Lundberg. There's other reasons as to why I'm a United Methodist, but that is a big one because their passion for serving the world matches my own,
Mhm.
so yeah.
Yeah, that's really
There
cool.
there are organizational ways that we in our very structure, you know, serve the world and expand the love of God beyond ourselves.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Cool. Well, that concludes our this sermon series.
it does.
Any other closing thoughts or anything like that?
Um, Not really. No, I felt good about Sunday's sermon. I think I wrapped it up really nicely, and also, kind of I tied. I mean, the one thing I wanted us to see is that this is not a five-step process. This is more of this is a response to the things that Jesus has called us to do, which is to love God and love neighbor. And so the first 4 weeks were very much how we love God. We love God with, just by saying that we love God and feeling that in our hearts. We do that through finding our joy in our faith, finding the joy that God gives us. We do that through returning gratitude to God. We do that through praying constantly. And then the shift happens in this fifth step of this is where the rubber meets the road. It's not enough for us to love God, but we do, and that's important. But that love has to go somewhere. And where that love has to go is out. And so
Mhm.
that's why loving others is such an intrinsic part of who we are as United Methodists.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
I like it.
there we go.
I also liked how you said this is not excluding. You said it a few times. This is not
Hmm.
exclusive to United Methodist,
Yeah.
but it's this these are requirements of being
Hmm.
who we are, if you're
Right.
truly being who we are.
Yep. Yeah. I never want to paint us as we're the best and we're the only people that live faithfully. And that's never how I want to come off and never what I want to communicate because that's not what I believe. I believe that denominations are good. I believe that we just have certain ways of seeing things a little bit differently when it comes to theology. But as long as we are under the large tent of we follow Jesus first, we can jive together. So
Mhm.
I never want there to be an exceptionalism to United Methodism. I think that would be contrary to our nature, especially because John Wesley did not intend to start a new Christian denomination. John Wesley, much like Martin Luther, just wanted to see reform happen in the Church of England. John Wesley wanted to see people taking their faith seriously. And when they pushed against that, he said, well, I guess then we're going to have to strike and go in different directions, you know? So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, his intention was never to cause a rift.
No,
It sure doesn't seem.
no, no. His intention was to strengthen what exists. I mean, there's a reason why he called field preaching vile, and he had to write in his own words in his journal that when he finally became convinced, because he went and saw George Whitefield do open air preaching and see people he would not see in church respond to the gospel message, he had to say, I will submit to become more vile and start to proclaim the love of God on the highways and the byways of the world. Because he loves the church. There's a reason why he kept asking to go to churches and proclaim his messages, because he wanted the churches to be strengthened rather than be rejected, rather than trying to go in. He wasn't trying to go in and piss people off, but he was pissing people off. And for a long stretch there, his journals are on Sundays saying, I went to go preach at St. Elizabeth's. I was asked not to return. I was at this church and they asked me not to come back. I asked to go to this church and they told me no.
Hmm.
He was rocking the boat but that's not, he never wanted to be separated from the church. He wanted to strengthen it and bolster it so that it took its faith seriously in the way that he envisioned the faith, people taking their faith seriously. Yeah.
It's really neat.
Yep. So
So when's your next Wesley history lesson for us?
anytime,
Perfect.
literally anytime. I am always ready to talk about church camp and I'm always ready to talk about John Wesley. So
Hmm.
Yep.
That's
So
cool.
I had a parishioner of mine back in the Burt congregation joked with me because I did a pretty strong, not this exact sermon series, but one pretty similar to it. And she's like, "You are the most nerdy United Methodist I've ever met." And I was like, "Thank you. That's the nicest thing you could have ever said to me." So
Mhm.
yeah,
Nice.
yep. But
Cool.
yep,
Well, we should wrap this guy up.
you bet.
Um, what's the next sermon series we're gonna go into?
Yeah, so this is Love Month. But February is the month where we are focused on expressions of love. It's Valentine's Day. Our stores have vomited love all over the place.
Gross.
I know, right? So what I want us to see in these weeks leading up to Lent is just the way that God's love looks different than the expressions of love that we'll see around us in the next month. So we're going to be talking about loving large. And so Sunday, we're going to be talking about how God's love marks us, separates us, and then through that separation unifies us with others who have been similarly marked by the love of God. So we're reading from the Song of Solomon, which is not a super popular book to preach from because it's Hebrew love poetry, and also
Is
real
this
interesting.
I was gonna say, is this sermon series after dark or what do we?
No, definitely not. No, but I will have to fight there. There was a great image I was shown in Intro to the Bible where someone took all the descriptions of a woman very literally in the way that the woman is
A deer.
described. Yeah, a deer, a herd of sheep, a pot of honey, and so he took that to the literal sense of things and drew it out. And that's what Dr. Hickel showed us during Intro to the Bible when we were talking about Song of Solomon.
That's
Um,
funny.
but we're talking about a portion of it where it says that love is set upon us as a seal. Set me as a seal upon your heart. And then love is as strong as death. Death cannot end love. Love keeps going on even after death. And this is the nature of God's love for us. That is bigger than the Hershey's Kisses, bigger than the Whitman sampler, bigger than even the flowers that they'll get from your mother and father-in-law. The love of God lasts longer even than that. So we'll be
Mhm.
digging into that, and then we'll be digging into in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about how our generosity is an expression of love for God and for neighbor, and then also wrapping it up with sheeps and the goats on the 23rd of February by talking about if love is really able to change the world. So
Cool.
yeah,
Sounds good.
yep.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's Cut for Time podcast. Join us again next week in person at the church at 10 a.m. or back here for the podcast next week.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.